Welcome. I'm Dame Stephanie Shirley, and I'm here as a patron and enthusiastic supporter of autism projects. I'm also the loving mother of Giles, who was profoundly autistic and challenging, and he lost the little speech that he had at around about 2.5 years and never spoke again. Giles was the first resident in the first home of the first charity that I set up. That was Autism at Kingwood. I'm an expert on puberty, having myself gone straight from puberty to midlife crises, so just starting to get over it. During adolescence, that psychological and social transition between childhood and scary adulthood, thought to be somewhere between 8 and 18. The bodily changes, what we call puberty, are unparalleled since infancy. Children grow and put on weight, lose up to 30% of their bone density, and may have their first epileptic seizures. Girls start to menstruate, and both boys and girls grow body hair. MRI images show the brain changes associated with puberty. Life's transitions, always difficult for those with autism, go with roller coaster mood swings, looping between misery and mania during adolescence. Mental health issues tend to increase at each transitional stage of life. So the support organisations provide is vital to autistic people's quality of life. Their transitions challenge those who care. Adolescence is the only problem that disappears if you wait long enough. Think back to the turbulence of your own adolescence, and puberty is probably about as rough as it gets. Having seen psychologist Dr. Sally Powers's presentation, I wanted to bring it to a wider audience.
So this is me, for those of you that don't know me, Sally Powers, clinical psychologist. I work for Autism at Kingwood, amongst other people at the moment. I've worked in the NHS with adults and children on the autistic spectrum over the years, assessment and diagnosis, therapy, all sorts of interventions. And today I'm going to talk about sexuality, puberty and relationships in autism. It's a very popular topic, but for good reason, which I hope you'll understand as I go through and talk about it. So I usually start off by asking people, what is it? If I was to say to you sexuality, it's kind of cheating because you've got the answers up here now. But it's interesting how much people struggle to define it and to say what areas of their lives it affects or it doesn't affect. People often come up with answers like, if I was asking you to talk to the person next to you and think about what it would mean to you, people often say, well, gender, yeah, who I have sex with or don't have sex with, that kind of thing. But it's actually, it affects a huge amount of our lives and how we interact with other people, how we choose to express ourselves. A textbook definition would be this: all the aspects of one's constitution and behaviour that are related to sex. So it spans the biological, so actually what body parts are you born with? What does your body look like underneath all your clothes? It spans the psychological, what you think about that and how you feel about that. The social aspects, because if you think about it, quite often we choose to associate with people, or our friends might be people who have a similar expression of sexuality and gender to us, to ourselves. So some people might choose to identify as being on the gay scene and will have friendships within that group. Others might choose to be in with people they associate with. So it's going to maybe affect, as you're growing up, your social scene. It's likely to affect your emotions and how you feel about yourself. If you think, I'm going to touch a lot on puberty in that area of life today where people are working out what their sexuality is and how they relate to people. So actually, if you feel different to other people, or if you feel you can't find your group to fit in with, or you feel that just you're uncomfortable with how your body's changing or what's happening to it, it's going to affect your emotional responses as well. And actually the values dimensions of our lives. So actually what that is saying in terms of the values of those people and who they accept and who they don't accept is quite strong. And if you're in this culture, 50, 100 years ago, it would have been similar. If you're in different cultures around the world, they'll have a very different attitude and view and value of people according to how they express their sexuality. So my argument is how we feel about ourselves, our gender, our bodies, what we do with those bodies, how we behave, they're all things that are affected by it. Any reason why you think I might have put in bold the social and the emotional aspects of it?
Because autism, people might struggle more with those areas.
Absolutely. So if you don't have autism, if you don't have a learning disability, they're areas you're going to struggle with. If you do, you've got that extra overlay. They're areas that people are going to struggle with before you even start getting into the kind of more tricky area of sexuality and things. So it's going to extend to our relationships with others, who we choose to have relationships with, who we choose to be friends with. That might be emotional intimacy, who you choose to share your emotions, your deepest feelings with, who you love. Might not have any choice in who you fall in love with, might be quite inconvenient, but that's the person you've fallen in love with, and you're stuck with it. And actually that might be different to the person you choose to be sexually intimate with. You might have quite different views on who you're choosing to actually have sex with. So it's about all of who you are. It's not as simple or as straightforward as people might imagine, if you like.
Do you think some of the behaviours that that people experience with people with on the spectrum could be associated with this because they can't express how they're feeling, because there's a lot of challenging behaviours when they get to teenage years like this? Do you think it's because of people like us who probably support them, but we don't understand? How would you help us in this context?
Okay. Yes, I mean, I think you're right. So like being unable to express the emotions, so the feelings that go on, the physical feelings and the emotional feelings that go on through all the kind of sexual awareness and development. Yes, I'm sure it is that people either don't know how to express it or are expressing it inappropriately. As in, they're just expressing it as it comes out, and actually, here's not the place. You know, best not to do that in the middle of Sainsbury's. People don't like it, that kind of thing. So I think from our role, working with and supporting people, it might be about watching and seeing and asking sometimes, trying to ask the person if that's how they're feeling, if they're feeling that they like that lady or they like that man or they want to spend more time with that person, and then trying to have those conversations and explanations with them. So the last part of this, I'm going to get on to much more practical tips, what you do. At the very end, there's a kind of something that was put together by a men's group many years ago by a lovely psychologist I used to work with, who, and it goes through literally in pictures of, you start by having a bath, then you do this, then you do this. So it's kind of helping someone see in a very visual format, which not everyone on the spectrum is visual, but a lot of people are. So you're giving very clear, concrete instructions about what's okay and what's not okay. So the last part of the presentation, I hope, will answer that. If it doesn't, then ask and I'll try and come up with more. So how did you all learn about it then? I'm going to go back now, not give you the answers this time. So if you think about it, how did you learn about sex and sexuality in relationships?
School.
Yeah, common one, school. Yeah, I learned at school.
Friends. Experimenting.
Yeah. Experiences. Dare I say making mistakes?
Yeah.
Usually. Thinking the next day, I'm never doing that again. Absolutely mortified. Why did I do that? Aided or unaided by alcohol. Yeah. Certainly I can remember learning at school. I went to an all-girls school, quite an academic school, and it was part of biology lessons. So there was nothing emotional, or you didn't do feelings or any of that kind of stuff. It was just, this is what happens. And I think we were about 11 or 12, and you come out going, oh, that's disgusting, I'm never doing that, that's horrible. But yeah, there are whole other aspects to it then, certainly back in my day, that didn't get taught, if you like. So you're right, from peers, so from friends, you might be having those conversations. In my day, it was Jackie magazine as well. I think it's probably Cosmopolitan and things like that now, where there are far more frank discussions even than there were, certainly in my day. Some people learn from parents. Sometimes parents will sit down and have the conversation or the book to describe and talk about what's going on. Some people will learn from books. I remember my next door neighbour had a copy of the Kama Sutra when I used to babysit, and I used to enjoy babysitting for her because it looked quite bizarre at that age. And by making mistakes, as you say, by experience, by trial and error. We have the luxury of doing that, if you like, of making mistakes. Sometimes we're very protective of the people that we support and the people we work alongside, and we're reluctant to let them try something and get it wrong and make a mistake, because it can be very upsetting. I worked many years ago with I remember a wonderful lady, a social worker, who, in trying to promote a relationship for a young lady on the spectrum with a mild learning disability, was just so concerned, but she might get hurt, she might get hurt. Yes, she might. We all might get hurt in a relationship. We don't know. It's an unknown when you go into it. But actually, you need to have the opportunity to have those experiences and make that mistake to learn in the first place.
Listening to you speak, it was really obvious, like any group of adults, there should be ways that we support and educate and encourage people to have knowledge about sexuality and being safe. And I suppose I wondered if you had any advice or resources you could signpost people onto in terms of how to talk about sex or masturbation with people on the spectrum.
Okay. I think I probably mentioned part of the difficulty is that a lot of the resources that are published are for children. So the format and the style that are used are very good because they tend to be visual, but then sometimes even the amount of words used in them is overwhelming and a bit too much. So my advice usually is either you might need to draw up stuff yourself with somebody that is visual, is simple. You can use things like there are some resources out there by Build, by the Family Planning Association. There are books that are available that will have simple line drawings that you can explain body parts, you can explain relationships, you can explain what happens in sex. But I would say keeping it very clear, keeping it very concrete, and actually keeping it very factual for people. There are also, if you're, and this is a very difficult area, if you are wanting to teach somebody how to masturbate appropriately, there are a couple of really good DVDs that we used to joke get used quite a lot, but that in itself is an indication there is a need for them. And Dave Hinsberger is the guy who produces the one for men, and it is a very clear video taking you through from the beginning on how you must draw the curtains, how to be safe, how to be private, you can stop watching any point you want to, and then he literally shows a male how to masturbate start to finish, how to clear up afterwards. So I have yet to come across somebody who, having watched that, isn't able to work it out for themselves, even people with quite severe learning disabilities, because Sexual Offences Act means you cannot show somebody, you cannot help somebody, but that is a very good way of doing it. And there is an equivalent one for females. So Handmade Love for men and Fingertips for females.
Because I remember that being the take-home message of your talk, that we have a group of people who we know are prone to aggression or anger or frustration, don't thrive socially, and we shy away from talking to them about sex, masturbation, relationship. Why do you think it is that there's not the same availability in terms of education?
I think it's a difficult one. I think it's kind of multi-pronged. There is the study that shows that people on the spectrum generally receive less sex ed. As far as I'm aware, in schools they still have to ask the parents' permission for children to be given sex education. They're not so much these days, but historically, and I think there will still be some parents who feel that if you give people that information, they're all going to run out and have sex without really understanding what they're doing. So I think there's sometimes parents are scared that they think their children won't understand, they won't be able to take that on board, they'll get themselves into vulnerable and risky situations with kind of some information but not enough information. I mean, the reality is what the research shows is that if you give people the information, there is much lower rates of promiscuous sex or of teenage pregnancies or anything like that. That information is what helps people stay safe. So I think that's part of the reason. I think other reasons are that the way sex ed is often taught in schools, particularly in mainstream schools, and you've got kids with Asperger's or high functioning autism there, it's not accessible to them. It doesn't. So often I'll work with adults and I'll be saying, so did you not have this at school? And I'll say, well, yeah, there was sex ed, but I couldn't take it all in, I couldn't process it, I couldn't make sense of it, or I didn't understand it. So however the information is being given to them, it's not being given in a way that works for them. And usually that's a very, as I said before, visual pictures. it's an area they probably don't want to give too many pictures, too many explicit drawings, but that's what's needed. Drawings, it's needed clear communication, and probably in smaller chunks to be able to be processed.
That's really interesting though, isn't it? That the more delicate a subject, I'm thinking about grief and dying, and we make love, or we pass over, or we shy away from using direct language.
Absolutely.
And make it a lot more confusing.
Yeah, and a few years ago, in partnership with a local charity, we did a workshop over 3 weekends for young people with autism, and I had the group, the part of it for each of these kids that was the nitty gritty, what goes where, how do you do it, what do you do? And actually, you have to go right back to the beginning. I started with actually what are the words they're using, the slang words for sexual intercourse, which are mostly insulting words that are used in our language. Lots of these kids, I could hear them outside the room effing and blinding, and when you explain to them, well, actually that means sexual intercourse, they're completely flabbergasted. They don't have a clue. So they're picking up like language use around sex and relationships and using it because that's what they're hearing others use, but not necessarily understanding. And the same can apply for the acts of it, of actually what you're doing with somebody else. There was a programme in the 1980s, a long time ago, the Benhaven programme, where they were using a sex ed package for people with learning disabilities, and what they found was that for the people with autism, they had to adapt it even further because they had to start again right back with the kind of socio-sexual component, and with things like personal hygiene and cleanliness and the words to use. You've kind of got to come right back to the beginning so that it's a logical progression all the way through and you're covering all your bases. And that's when I refer to things like the kind of things like this, the 31 steps kind of stuff, where it's very visual, it's very clear, it tells you what to do, anything like that is helpful for somebody.
So those are steps to meet, to get a boyfriend or to get a girlfriend, right from the beginning.
Those are, but you can similarly do, steps in. It takes you through, how a relationship might progress towards having sex with somebody, how you might go into a long-term relationship, even how you might propose, things like that. Yeah, but it's a logical progression and an understanding. You can't assume that people will have picked up the instinctive social rules around relationships, around sex, that everybody else does. So it's making it explicit.
It sounds like you're saying that the idea that you would encourage people to be having sex or promiscuous or doing risky things, if you open that can of worms by talking about it, is fundamentally a flawed argument.
Yeah.
I'm picturing some of the high-functioning people who may be conscious of not having had sex or being a virgin in their 40s, and to not give that person access to even the information feels really quite wrong.
Yeah, and it's like anybody, if you are worried about not having done something or doing something, or there's something you desperately want to do, but you don't even know the basics of it, would they still want to do that if it was explained? Or would they kind of think, actually, I'm not ready for that? I've had clients where I've made that assumption and I've got that wrong, that actually they're at a much earlier stage of a relationship, even as adults in their 40s, 50s, and don't want all that, thank you. They just want to kind of stay at a kind of less physically close level. I'm trying to think of a way to say it. But yeah, so it's also... But you need to have that information to know that. And if you don't have the information, you're more likely to find yourself in a difficult situation, or more vulnerable, or more at risk of somebody else doing something to you, or not understanding that this is what's happening here, and I need to say, no, I don't want to do that, because you don't know what's coming. So actually people can keep themselves safer with that information. So what's going on then, typically, in adolescent development? There's an awful lot happening all at the same time on lots of different levels. So physically, it's a time of rapid change in the body. Things are growing, hairs are sprouting everywhere, stuff is happening in your body, and you're not in control of it. It's doing it without your say-so or without your permission, if you like. Cognitively, this is where, when you think about Piaget's stages of development, concrete thinking starts to move into abstract thinking for teenagers. People are able to hold much wider ideas, much more abstract ideas, not just about things that are there in front of them, able to hold much more in mind. Emotionally, and this is all for people without autism, emotionally it's a time of strong emotions, sexual impulses, a challenge of learning to control them. Teenagers in general, not just teenage boys, it's a challenge to control those steadily increasing impulses and the emotions that go alongside them. It's learning that it's not okay to do that in public. It's not cool to say that amongst your friends or in the wrong place. So most of us throughout that period are kind of gauging how life is, what we can manage, what's acceptable, according to the culture we're in, the society we're in. And socially, psychologically, if you like, this is where you get a strong need to be with your peer group all the time. So this is where they say that actually the attention shifts, if you like. Children will pay more attention to their peers once they start getting into adolescence than they will to their parents. This is where peer opinion becomes far more important than parental opinion in terms of how you see yourself, what you're doing to try and fit in with the group that you're with. You're forming your identity. Actually, am I going to agree with my parents' opinions, or am I going to think something quite different? Am I going to have values and opinions quite different to theirs? I remember years ago being told, I'm not sure I've read it anywhere, that somebody said to me, it's okay, by the time they're 30, their basic values will come back to those that you brought them up with, which I found hugely a great relief. But actually through the teens, it might be about saying, no, I'm not you, I'm someone different, and I'm going to hold different opinions. So this is all part of the individuating process that's happening throughout the teenage years for most people, most young people. So there are things that are the same. There are a lot of things that are different for people on the autistic spectrum. So the things that might be the same, the expectations to be able to have a partner, to grow up, to have a family, to settle down. We know that actually it's a very small percentage of people on the spectrum who manage to achieve that. I know, as lots of other people do, from my work with people on the spectrum, that a very large percentage of them are desperately keen to have a partner, desperately keen to settle down. But the actual building blocks of starting to have a relationship, those social skills that are required to be able to go and talk to somebody, to meet somebody in the first place, to be able to go to a venue or a place where they're likely to meet somebody, are sometimes just way out of range for them. It is too anxiety provoking, it's too scary, it's just not something they feel that they could cope with doing. So even getting off the starting block and starting to find someone to have a relationship with, and then managing and tolerating that relationship, can be really difficult. I sometimes think we're guilty of setting too high expectations, if you like. Yes, people certainly have the same opportunity to do that, but the reality is it is often very, very difficult for them. And I think the media pushing out lots and lots of messages about everyone can have a family, everyone can have a partnership, sets people up to fail sometimes.
So as we're talking a lot today about support workers, parents, and helping people with autism to explore these new intimacy areas. How do you kind of, obviously there's an aspect where the open-mindedness and the judgment of the support worker or the family member can get in the way of that.
Yeah.
And obviously it can be quite a sensitive area. It's very personal to all of us, of course, sexuality.
Yeah.
But I guess it's still important to try and enable that person to follow their desires, irrelevant of your own judgments on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we often say to support staff, actually, when you come to do this work to support people, you put your own values, your own attitudes and beliefs, if you like, aside, and you're working somebody to work with theirs. Equally, I think we have to recognise when somebody really has strong feelings. I have known situations where staff have had really strong ideas about whether somebody should or shouldn't be in a relationship, and that has leaked out, and it's really hard not to, and then maybe it's not appropriate for that person to work with them. A gentleman I worked with a long time ago who actually has transitioned to female, one of the big differences for him was when his staff changed and he had somebody who was supportive and was willing to go along and help him through, in fact she, as she now is, through the whole process. So similarly, I think we come back to the issues around the Sexual Offences Act, but also around the reality and how do you support somebody. So there are many people on the spectrum who aren't particularly interested in having a relationship, say. So the kind of whole messy emotional side of it is not for them. They really don't want that, thank you. But they still have a sexual interest and a sex drive, and they want to do something about that. So then you get into, okay, they don't really want to engage with another person. I've had a few clients actually who will say, well, I know that I can look in, one gentleman used to say to me, I know I can look in the back pages of the paper and there's ladies there that'll do what I want them to do, for money, so sex workers. So sometimes it might be around helping someone find that information. So I've known clients who, having actually given them information around it, they've gone off on their own, of their own accord, and have paid to have sex with somebody, and actually in some cases have done that and said, oh, no thanks, tried it, that's enough.
I guess it's quite useful in a way to kind of get that off your mind, isn't
Yeah.
it? If that's
Yeah, because that was a real fixation
Obsession,
for
yeah.
him, a real obsession for him.
and it can
actually,
be so many, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially males of a certain age.
absolutely, yeah, and because that feeling that everybody else is out there doing it and I'm not, so
Yeah.
I'm losing out in some way. So so having tried it, he didn't think it was so great. But
I guess it's
equally,
important that he was
able to do
supported,
that,
if that was
yeah.
his wish, to do that.
And he was a very able gentleman and was able to get himself to and from, and he was aware enough, we were able to talk through, if you were to do that, what would be the risks again. So thinking about what are the risks, how do you mitigate those risks, how do you ensure as much as you can that somebody's safe in that situation. And it comes back to, again, does somebody need some support to do that? There is, I've mentioned before, there's a website, tlc.com or .co.uk, and it says very clearly, I think they're very good on there, they go through the whole Sexual Offences Act and explain that it is not an offence if somebody wishes to access a sex worker but they're not able to do that themselves, as in they're too anxious to be able to make the appointment because of their autism, or they're physically disabled.
Okay, that's interesting.
Then if it's them leading it,
So if a support
You're
worker
not.
is open-minded enough and comfortable enough to help support someone with that very personal need, they wouldn't be prosecuted that under law, as we know.
I can't say a definite yes or no, but one would hope that that is the case. Yes, I mean, and it would be worth contacting these people to double check to find that out. I mean, they even suggest on the website that if you have somebody who needs to have a support worker in the house downstairs or something whilst one of their sex workers visits, they understand that there might be a need for that. So they're very open to working with people with disabilities, and they list Asperger's syndrome as one of the disabilities they work with people on there. Hopes and wishes might be exactly the same. So yeah, absolutely. I've mentioned people should have the same equality, they should have the same opportunities to be able to have these relationships and to be able to meet people and to be able to socialise and to live a life as they would wish to. As I've said, that's often very difficult for people though. There is a thing called the European Charter of Rights for people with autism, which actually came out in the 90s. I didn't come across it till much later. They have a right to have a partner. It's a very forward-thinking document. It's good. What about the physical side of it? Well, actually, that's very similar. There's no differences in that. People on the spectrum certainly experience sexual arousal in exactly the same way that anybody else with. So there have been some studies into this with adolescents with high-functioning autism, and they've matched them against controls, neurotypical controls, people without autism, and they've shown there's no significant difference between the groups in terms of their interest in sexual behaviour, sexual matters, and their actual behaviour in terms of what they do. However, the feelings that they feel, the feelings of love, might be experienced differently. So this comes from Wen Lawson, who writes and talks a lot about autism. He's on the spectrum himself. And he talks about it sometimes being more intense, being almost more like a crush or an obsession with somebody, that all-consuming passion about somebody. And it might be less likely to be focused on adjusting yourself to please that person, doing things because you think they'd like it, doing things because you think that would be good for them, because then they would enjoy it.